Take two. Hey everyone. Today I want to talk about Linux. Now, for reference, I have been using Microsoft operating systems starting with MS-DOS and Windows 3.1. This was around the mid-90s. I was pretty happy with it. Grant you, it did take me a while to learn all the ins and outs of Windows, and especially as each iteration was released. But in time, I learned, and in a way, eventually mastered Windows. Now, I had heard about Linux, what was it, around 1999 or 2000? And I briefly wondered about how it was in comparison to Windows, but I dismissed this because, I had just gotten to the point where I really was very comfortable and I knew what I was doing in Windows, and I had also learned enough that other users, friends, family, whomever, if they needed help with their computer, they would pretty much call on me. So at that point, I thought to myself, why would I want to go to another operating system now? I just figured out Windows. I really did not have the drive to jump to another operating system at that time. Now, in a way, I am kicking myself for not having looked into Linux all those years ago. Though it's likely, had I looked into Linux back then, I might have gone full on and stopped using Windows altogether in favor of using Linux. I'm discovering so much about Linux and the features and the configurability, compatibility. I'm seriously considering, when I'm able to, buying a larger hard drive for my desktop computer and setting it up for a dual boot. The thing is, I'm going to college and my coursework is computer science, focusing on cybersecurity, and this requires me to keep Windows. And what knowledge I have of Windows I need to keep intact, and I also need to update that knowledge base as each iteration of Windows is released and each time they upgrade Windows 10. So here we are this year, 2017. One of my required courses during the spring semester was called Introduction to Linux. This, along with a couple other courses, introduced me to virtualization. They were quite eye-opening. For the Linux course, we were required to put Ubuntu and Fedora into the virtual machine. For some reason, the instructor wanted us to use VMware, which I will say was okay. I rather liked it. Unfortunately, it was the free version. There were functions that I would like to have had, like the ability to create the snapshot, so that if I goofed anything, all I could do was just go back to the snapshot and start over again. I went to Oracle's VirtualBox, which was free and had what I wanted as far as what I was going to do with it, for that matter. And as you can see, I've gone just perhaps a bit too far with the number of virtual machines that I have at my fingertips. I didn't point it out. There was another course that had us download Kali. That's a subject for another video completely. So we will start off here in Ubuntu. So we started off with Ubuntu. And the first thing when I got into this operating system, this Linux distro, it was something of a culture shock. Having been using Windows for so long, it's like, surprise, here it is. Just for reference, I believe this is the Unity desktop environment. I will be doing a video in the future strictly on the variety of desktop environments. Of course, my mindset at the time was still very much stuck on Windows, so of course, instead of referring to this as the panel, right off the bat I'm thinking, okay, well, this must be the taskbar, so okay, this is probably the start button, this is not the start button. So, yeah, it really surprised me. I took some time just to explore Ubuntu, as well as following the instructions of the class. And there were many things that surprised me in a very good way. Even though there was the unfamiliarity of the desktop environment, there was a lot of familiarity in just what was available. You had your files. Yeah, this was very much, this was familiar. It was a lot like Windows. I mean, I'm still trying to figure out the file structure in a way. By that, I mean this file structure from root. I'm actually saving that for another video as well. But I am getting used to it. This here, these icons here, I have found that most of the distros for Linux come prepackaged with an open source office suite called LibreOffice. And much to my surprise, it not only opened and worked with MS Word docs, but docs that were created with Corel WordPerfect, which is something I have been using forever. I really didn't start using Word until quite recently. And what was even better was that it was able to open up the documents without screwing up the format. That just, to me, was one of the greatest things, because I worried about how is this going to be able to interact with the documents I already have. The inclusion of a software store or an app store was good. I mean, I know that Microsoft, they now have their little app store sort of thing. Apple has had an app store forever. Most of the apps and programs that are available here, even the ones that are available for Linux on other websites, by and large are free. Of course, there are many of these that have donation buttons where you can throw money at the developers. I would gladly do that if I wasn't perpetually broke. But I just think that this is one of the things that attracted me when I really started to get into Linux, is the community drive, a constant change, improvements, a lot of input-output. The whole concept of open source, now that I really know what it is, I very much like this model. One thing that puzzled me, though, about Ubuntu was this. I know Ubuntu's one of these distros that actually has, I guess, I don't know, what would you call it? A business partner or something? But there's actually a company behind Ubuntu. So I'm imagining that this may be why there was a button for Amazon. Actually, if I bring up the store again, I want to point out this also caused a little bit of culture shock for me, because I noticed that the minimize, maximize, full screen, and exit buttons are over here on the left, which is very much like how the Mac OS has been since the beginning. I have to constantly remind myself when I'm using Ubuntu, because by default my hand goes up here if I want to shut down a program or a window, whatever. I have to remember to go over here. As you see here, Ubuntu, like I would say most distributions, comes prepackaged with Firefox for the web browser. And I know I will catch heat for putting in Google Chrome, but I've been using Chrome for years. My phone is an Android phone. It's just what I'm used to. But I know I'm going to catch a lot of heat. But I do want to point out something, and I will use Chrome for this. Actually, it was the first time I opened something full screen, and I'm like, okay, where's my toolbar? Where are my buttons? Ubuntu, I think this is probably unique to the Unity desktop. Correct me if I'm wrong. Definitely, anybody watches this video, if you really know your stuff when it comes to Linux, feel free to correct me when I'm wrong, because I feel I will be wrong quite often. But the very first time I ran something in a full screen, and I suddenly realized there were things missing. And I'm just sort of moving my mouse all over the place trying to figure out, okay, what do I do? Then I moved it up here. And that's where I found this little uniqueness, that you had a mouse up here in this little bar at the top to get your file, edit, view, history, so on and so forth. And of course, there are your buttons. So this is pretty good. I rather liked that. And of course, there are the settings. Fairly intuitive, easy to use. I don't really have anything negative to say about it. I've actually found that configuring things, for what little I've actually done, has been very easy. Linux seems to just adapt to whatever hardware is plugged into your computer. Granted, I'm using this through a virtual machine, and it is using VirtualBox guest applications, which sort of bridges things across from the host to the guest. But I can only believe that were I running this on the hardware itself and not in a virtual environment, everything that I've read seems to be indicating that compatibility is really not much of an issue when it comes to using most hardware in a Linux environment. Now, below this, the settings, I've installed this. It's a screensaver package because I'm old school. I absolutely love screensavers. So, and this I actually turned on. This I found to be a very interesting feature of Ubuntu, in that you can change workspaces. It gives you 4 different workspaces or desktops to work with. Now, I have heard that this is also a feature, I believe, in Mac OS. Supposedly, Windows has something like this, but I've never explored it. I think this would be very good, especially if you only have a single monitor that you're working with, that you can, if you're researching something, you can have your word processor here and switch to here to have your browser open, to get your information, and any other things you need to have open to work with. If you don't want them in the way, you can put them on these other workstations, or excuse me, not workstations, workspaces. Even with a script, I'm getting crazy. And this here is just an icon because I have an external drive plugged in. So overall, it was somewhat of a culture shock, but Ubuntu, it was pretty good. I hadn't really had any problems with it. Granted, I really can't say I'm much of a fan of the Unity desktop. I mean, I could work with it, but I'm an old fart. I'm very used to a Windows sort of environment. And there are desktop environments that are more like Windows, but again, that's for another video. Fedora was the other distro that I was required to use in the Intro to Linux course. And if I thought the culture shock of going into Ubuntu was fairly jarring, this was a bit... It reminded me a lot of when I first started in MS-DOS. You just basically had, I mean, the only real difference is, okay, you have some nice colorful backgrounds, but it's like the operating system starts up and says, "Good luck, sucker." But I found accessing things, it really wasn't so bad. Fedora by default comes with the GNOME desktop environment. It's very simple. It's, you have this bar up here, which of course has the date and time, your connection status of the volume, and of course your way of shutting the operating system down. Activities, basically there's your start button. It brings you to a different desktop where here you have your panel, as I discovered it was called, that has your likely most used programs, and you have a search box up here. I found this, of course, accessing programs and whatnot in Fedora was not as hard as I had initially perceived. As I said before, with most distros, you have your Firefox, you have Evolution, which is an email client, Rhythmbox, for music, I believe, Shotwell, which, as I understand, is it's sort of a Photoshop-esque program that can be used for photos and allegedly video, although I haven't really worked with this yet. Access to your file system, your file folders, and everything, and a software store. I actually appreciate that about these two distros, Ubuntu and Fedora, that you don't have to search high and low for something that you want to put onto your computer in this environment. Now, you have access to all of your applications clicking this, and it's a fairly good selection of apps that come with Fedora. Calendar, clocks, cheese. I suppose this is another Photoshop-esque program. I haven't messed with it, so access to your contacts, access to your documents, LibreOffice suite, of course, a mapping program. That's actually rather nice. Of course, your settings, a text editor, a separate area for the multitude of utilities, and you have a weather app here. kind of nice to have. One thing I did not mention this when I was talking about Ubuntu, and I'm actually going to devote a full video to this because there's so much to talk about. It's the terminal. The terminal, I would say, is akin to the command prompt in Windows, but unlike that, the terminal, at least my perception of the terminal, is that it has far more relevance related to its use in Linux than the command prompt does being used in Windows. The vast majority of people who use Windows, I would say even people who are quite high up in the hierarchy of knowledge, may not use the command prompt that often. Then again, maybe they do. I haven't really used it a lot myself, but I'm finding out that terminal and Linux is like a combination of peanut butter and jelly. You have to really get used to using commands. So overall, how would I say I felt about Linux at the very beginning? I would say a bit nervous, but still quite fascinated. I found out that as I went along, Linux is not like Windows in the way of, well, here's Windows, boom, and that's it. Each iteration of Windows, there is a great deal of familiarity, but not a lot of, you really can't configure Windows the way you can with Linux. Linux has so many different distros. I believe I read somewhere someone called it the flavors. And also, I had mentioned desktop environments. There are a ton of those as well. For myself, I've only been working with Linux for about 6 months. And I still have all these questions. Oh, which distro would be best for me? Which desktop environment would work best with me? What's going to work best with my hardware? I just have 10 gazillion questions, which is actually down from a lot of the questions I had at the very beginning. I'm still very much a noob, and working with Linux, I'm of course doing it through the eyes of a noob, because it's only been 6 months. I'm still trying to keep a lot of the command line lingo, the commands themselves and the structure. I'm still trying to keep a lot of those in mind, so that when I'm tinkering around in terminal, I don't screw anything up. But the way I see it, I did not learn Windows overnight. And I guess the same could be said for Linux. So, through this series, I'm going to explore more aspects of Linux. I'll be showing and talking about some of the distros that I've picked up, the different desktop environments, and anything else about Linux that I can actually think of to discuss from a noob's view. Hope that you will come along with me on this journey, and perhaps I will learn a great deal by doing it this way. So I hope you enjoyed this first video. Please comment below, like and share these videos, and of course if you'd like to, subscribe to my channel, see some of the videos that I did before. So with that, I'm Nariko Murakami. See ya.